up, y'all? It's Greek, back with another edition of Tutorial Tuesday. Let's get it. So my idea for this tutorial came when I was working with a rapper out in Phoenix. And he was really good, but he never really recorded anything or actually done anything digitally at all. I mean, he was just a dude that just rapped. He did a couple live shows, and that was kind of it. And so when he found out that I made beats and we started getting together, we started talking music. Well, I started talking to him about all these production definitions and jargon, basically. And I saw his eyes kind of being like, what the hell is this dude talking about? And then he finally just came out and said it, like, hey man, I don't really know a whole lot about this music stuff, and I don't really know what you're talking about. So I even tried to dumb it down for him, and he still didn't know what I was talking about. It's not that he was dumb or anything, it's just this production world's almost like a foreign language sometimes. So what I wanted to do with this video is I wanted to actually go over a lot of the terms that you might hear me use in these videos, or you might hear other people use in other tutorials. Sometimes to understand certain concepts and things of music production, you have to have a baseline knowledge. And when I'm putting these videos out on YouTube, I have no idea your personal experience level. So chances are this video is going to be more for beginners than more experienced people, but at the same time, maybe there's words that you've heard or never came across yet that maybe you should know, so that could help out. Or if you're a producer and you're looking to make your own videos and stuff like that, maybe this will help you how to teach other people as well. So what we're going to do is I literally am going to go through the alphabet and I'm going to come up with a word that has to do with something music production related. I think we're only going to go A through M in this video, and then we'll do the second half of the alphabet next week, and we're just going to go through some of these definitions of some of these words, what they are, when you might use them, and then hopefully when producers are trying to teach you all this stuff on these YouTube tutorials or whatever, you have a better idea on what the hell they're talking about. Let's get into it. All right, so we're obviously going to start with A, and the word I chose for this was arrangement. So what is an arrangement? All right, so usually when I start making a beat, for instance, on this beat, I really just started with this section right here. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 layers of different sounds. And they're all playing at the same time. Now, I'm not just gonna play this whole entire thing throughout the whole entire track. What the arrangement is adding and subtracting different layers and different patterns at different parts of the track. And then the reason you want to actually arrange your track differently, where you drop out or add different sounds, it helps bring energy and emotion. So if you look here on this first section, I have all the pieces. And then in the second part, you'll notice this part right here is a synth sound. I didn't have it here. And then also I got these hi-hats going right here, but I took a little break in some parts as well. And then in this next section too, I dropped out some instruments and had them going here and there. So the arrangement is just basically putting all the different layers and patterns into different places to help make it a full beat. All right, the next letter is B, so I chose bus, more technically known as a mixer bus. I just did a video on this in Tutorial Tuesday. So a mixer bus is basically taking a channel and sending it to a separate channel before it goes to the master channel. Typically when you have any different sound here in your channel rack, this one for instance, it's not set to any channel, so it's just gonna go to the master. What I do to help be able to control each individual sounds, I actually send them to a specific channel. Now on this particular beat, I needed to do an automation clip with just a couple of the instruments and not all of them. And so you'll notice that for channels 2, 3, and 4, they all have this green line going to channel 10. So basically, instead of the sound going into channel 2, then directly to the master, it's going from channel 2 to channel 10 to the master. Kind of just a detour for that audio signal. Buses are commonly used for a mixing technique. By sending things to different channels, it allows you more options on how to edit and manipulate the sound. Buses are a little bit more advanced kind of concept, so if you are more interested in this, again, check the video I did before. All right, next up we got the letter C, and C is gonna be for clipping. So if you click on this icon right here, it'll toggle on and off the mixer, and next to the mixer you'll see all these numbers. This is the dB meter, the decibel meter, basically how loud is the signal that's coming into the channel. So I got this kick set up right here. If you pay attention to the dB meter over here, when I play the kick, it stops right at 0 dB. That's good, because as soon as it goes to 0 dB, that's as loud as you can get it before it starts clipping. When something is clipping, that means it's creating unnecessary, unwanted distortion, which will take energy away from all the different sounds that you're trying to use. So a lot of times, obviously we want our drums and our beats to slap, so we just raise the volume on them as high as we possibly can, but louder doesn't necessarily mean that it hits harder. Sometimes it's so loud that that kick sound is just literally going through the roof like this. And while on its own, maybe it sounds okay, but when you add all the other instruments and sounds into your beat, because that kick is so loud, it's gonna take away the energy from those other sounds. And those won't sound as good, they won't sound as loud, or they'll just be muddy and sound like crap. And so basically the goal is when you're mixing your track, you wanna make them as loud as you possibly can before they start clipping. And if you want tips and techniques on how to get your drums and stuff to hit hard without clipping, definitely let me know. We'll do a tutorial about that in the future. All right, next up we got D, and I chose dynamic range. Dynamic range is almost like a physics definition, where basically it's just the difference in the amplitude of a wave from its highest point to its lowest point. To dumb it down a little bit, I'll just give you a visual. So here's just a random sample that I had. And if you actually look at the wave, the dynamic range would be like, all right, so the amplitude is like how high the wave goes. So this particular wave right here goes from here to here, and the larger that wave looks, the louder it's gonna be, as opposed to maybe over here where the wave's a little bit shorter. It's not gonna be as loud. So the dynamic range is basically just talking about the difference between that, where it gets low in volume and then where it gets high. Dynamic range is important because it gives a certain texture to your sounds. All right, next up we got E. And so the word I chose for that was EQ. And so EQ is just short for equalization. You want to use EQ when simply adjusting the fader or the input knob aren't going to give you the sound that you want. So I almost always EQ all of my drums, especially the ones that are like organic samples. And the reason why is a lot of times these instruments will have unnecessary frequencies in them that I don't want. For instance, this snare, you can see with this EQ, I cut it so none of the bass or sub bass plays with the snare, and it only focuses on the mids and the high range stuff. EQ is another mixing technique that does two things. One, it helps the instrument that you're using stand out more in the overall song, and helps so it doesn't take energy away from other sounds that you have in your beat. Also, I did a tutorial on this about subtractive EQ. If you want to learn more about that, go ahead and check it out. And I think to really understand EQ, we need to get into our next letter, F, which is going to be for frequency spectrum. So the frequency spectrum is, again, another science physics term, which talks about waves and how they travel with electrons and shit like that. But in terms of music, the frequency spectrum just measures how high or low a sound is. For instance, Mariah Carey, she has a very high voice. Her voice is higher on the frequency spectrum. It's high pitched. Barry White, he has a very low voice, so it's lower on the frequency spectrum. Well, if you open up something like the parametric EQ2 right here, you can actually see the number in hertz of where that sound is showing up mostly in the frequency spectrum. So again, the snare, the brighter the line is where it's hitting the most. So it looks like around 200, and then right above 500 right there is where that sound is hitting the hardest. And so what you want to do when you're putting your track together is you want to fill out the frequency spectrum. You want some sounds in the highs, you want some sounds in the lows, you want some sounds in the mid, because the issue that you face when you're producing music is that you can only stack so many sounds in so many parts of the frequency spectrum. Now when you're down here in the lower region, you really can't fit a whole lot of sounds. Usually all you're going to have is the bass and a little bit of the kick. However, the higher you go in the frequency spectrum, the more instruments you can put in there with still being able to hear all of them. If you stack too many sounds at the same frequency, you won't be able to hear them, or it'll just sound muddy and clustered. If you spread your sounds out through the frequency spectrum, it'll sound like a more full, beautiful composition. And then that's where the EQ comes into place. Things like the snare are pretty much in the mid-range. I don't want the snare to interfere with anything going on the bass, so with this EQ, I cut out the low end in the frequency spectrum. With hi-hats, they're high, that's why they're called hi-hats. And so with the EQ, what I'll do is I'll cut off any frequencies or any vibrations that are going on in those parts of the frequency spectrum so they don't clash with the other instruments in the beat. Next up is G, and G is for gain staging. So gain staging is what you do kind of at the end of the beat when you're looking to mix it finally. And it also kind of goes along with clipping. Gain staging allows you to adjust the volume or levels of your sounds without them clipping. And there's a proper way to gain stage. Basically, when we talked about earlier, the audio signal going from the channel rack to a channel to the master, it's just basically a signal. It's a wave. It's an electronic piece of information that emits sound. And we need to make sure that that sound is not clipping before it goes into the channel and then to the master. Now, kind of like what we talked about with clipping, the first step is just make sure that your initial sound isn't going above 0 dB. But then when you route it to a channel, you're probably gonna add some effects on it. Well, effects are good because it makes your sounds sound cooler, but sometimes when you add an effect to it, increases the signal. And if you increase that signal too much, you'll run into a clipping issue. So what gain staging is the process of going through all the different elements of the signal, basically the path, from the beginning to the channel to all the effects that it goes through, and making sure that after that signal passes from one spot to the other, that it's not clipping at any point. Because at any point in that chain it starts clipping, you're gonna have unwanted distortion and your mix is gonna be shot. Also, sometimes with gain staging, you put effects on it and it dulls the sound, which could create a cool sound, but you still want it to stand out. So sometimes with the gain staging, you actually need to raise the levels on stuff. But gain staging simply is just making sure that your audio signal is at a proper level as it passes through everything. And once you have that down, then you'll be able to really get into the final mix and level it out properly. All right, next up we got H, which stands for high pass filter and low pass filter while we're at it. So a high pass filter basically allows all of the sound above a certain boundary line in the frequency spectrum to pass through, allowing it to stand out, and then it cuts out anything lower than that. So I got the snare pulled up right here, and you can see I cut out the low end right here, and the only thing that's gonna pass through is everything higher than this line right here on the frequency spectrum. So this high pass allows the high end sounds to go through and cuts out the low end. A low pass filter is the opposite. So I have it on my kick right here. I kind of put a boundary on to cut out anything above this 5K hertz right here. So high pass allows the high sounds through and a low pass allows the low sounds through. You also might hear the terms high cut and low cut, and then it's just opposite. Same concept though. All right, for I is gonna be input signal, and it kind of goes back into the gain staging a little bit, just in case you're still fuzzy on that. All right, so I am just gonna take a random drum sound, and the input signal is just the initial audio signal that goes in. And so right now I got the snare, it's not routed to anything, it's just gonna go straight to the master. So whatever the input signal is just gonna be whatever it is. Now, that's pretty straightforward. The reason this is a term is that you usually never make your beats like this. You usually do a lot more stuff to them. For instance, I would probably take the snare, send it to its own channel, and then I'd probably add an EQ on here, and then some other stuff. And so the input signal, maybe when you're dealing with a plugin like the EQ, is the signal going into the plugin. Now, once that signal goes into the plugin, you're gonna do stuff to it, right? And so the signal going in is gonna be different than when it comes out of this plugin. So now the snare isn't just going to the master anymore. It's going to channel 2, and then while it's in channel 2, it's going through this EQ, and then what other effects we end up putting on it or whatever. And then whatever comes out of this EQ is the output signal for the EQ that goes into the master. The input signal plays into clipping again as well. Whenever that input signal is going into anything, whether it's a new channel or a new plugin or whatever, you want to make sure that input signal is not clipping, because if it's already clipping before it goes into the plugin, it's still going to be clipping, if not even worse when it comes out, and so on. So the input signal is basically the signal of the audio before it goes into something, whatever it is. And then the output is obviously what that signal is after it gets processed by whatever plugin that you have and comes out. Next letter is J. J stands for jargon, because there's not really any production words that you use with J. So yeah, jargon. Next up for K, we got key. All right, key is just like the classic music term. I'm sure in music classes back in the day, you remember going over do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Apologize for my terrible voice. And so if we just go to the piano roll right here, for instance, C is a key. And we got C sharp and D and so on. So why is the key important? Well, when you're laying sounds on top of each other, if they are not in the same key, they're not going to sound very good. There's a very natural phenomenon that happens inside the human brain that when you hear certain sounds and they're the same key, it's a harmony. It sounds good. When things are out of key, then it doesn't sound as good, doesn't hit as hard, doesn't sound as full. And so when you're adding all your instruments together, especially the bass line and 808s, you want to make sure that even though they may occupy different parts of the frequency spectrum, they're still in the same key. I have a video on how to find the key of samples and then how to use that to create bass lines. But in that particular video, you can use that concept to create any instrument. So if you're struggling with that, definitely check out that video too. All right, next up is L. And L is gonna be for levels. Rarely ever does the word volume get used in music production. And the reason is because you want to be specific about how the sound is traveling. Volume is just too general of a term. You need to be specific on what you're talking about when you're changing the volume. So levels are referring to the mixer and where you have all your different fader knobs. As you can see on this beat, some of them are a little bit higher, some of them are a little bit lower. And so after you do all the gain staging, you want to make sure all your sounds aren't clipping. That's step one, but even when your sounds aren't clipping, you still want to change the levels on your sounds. Typically, you want some instruments. With me personally, I always like to have the kick and the snare stand out. So those are going to be at a higher level. So I'm going to level them up higher. And there's other sounds that I want in there that give the track, more emotion or more groove, but I don't want them to play as loud, so I level them down a little bit, just lower the level on them. And so to simplify it, like the levels are just basically taking the fader knob and making them as loud or as soft as you want to during the mixing process. And then finally, for this edition of the ABCs of music production, we got the mix. Perfect letter to end on. I mean, basically all the different things that we've talked about up to this point are different ways that'll affect your mix. So what is the mix? I mean, simply put, the mix is just all the different sounds together. And so what makes a good mix? Well, we already talked about some of it. One, filling up as much of the frequency spectrum as you possibly can. Two, making sure your levels aren't too high for some instruments or aren't too low where you can't even hear things. And then of course, making sure everything's not clipping so there's no unwanted distortion at all. The mix is basically the sum of most of the definitions that we talked about all put together. I mean, at the end of the day, you can find cool sounds, you can find cool drums, you can have a cool rhythm and all that, but if you don't mix it properly, if the sounds aren't leveled and they're not hitting at the right perceived volume, then your beat's gonna sound like trash. When I first started making beats, I had no idea what a mix was at all. And it wasn't until I started making a lot that I started training my ear to kind of hear things that maybe I didn't even notice before. I heard a story about The Game and 50 Cent's song, Hate It or Love It, which is a classic hip hop track, in that it wasn't until it got to Dr. Dre, who didn't make the original beat, that he put the final mix on it that was ready for it to be released. There was experts saying that even though all the sounds and everything were already arranged in the beat, it wouldn't have done as well or wouldn't have been as good a song had Dr. Dre not taken it and actually mixed it and leveled it and got all the frequencies and everything proper in it. I mean, a lot of times the difference between a good mix and a bad mix is, the difference between, sounding amateur and sounding like a pro. Like, that is the difference. And that just comes through repetition and making beats over and over again and training your ears and experimenting with different mixing techniques to get the sound that you want. All right, y'all, that's all I got for today. Next week on Tutorial Tuesday, we'll go N through Z, which I don't know what the hell I'm gonna come up with the letter Z. But hopefully going over a lot of these terms helps you get a better idea of what they actually mean and why they're important to music production. And while I do have a pretty good knowledge about music production, I don't know everything. I don't think anybody does. So if there's anything that anybody wants to add to one of these definitions, definitely throw them down there in the comments. If you're just confused about something and you're not really sure still after watching this video what it might mean, definitely let me know, because I want to be able to explain it in a way that you understand. And maybe if I'm not explaining it in a way that you understand, my own personal understanding of it really isn't that great either, so it'll help me out too. I also just want to make tutorial videos that people actually want, so please, if there's literally anything that you don't understand in this video, let me know and I'll try to learn it better and then explain it better in a tutorial in the future. Thank you again, everybody, for watching Tutorial Tuesday. It's Greek Indian Hip Hop Beats, aka Greek, aka Dat Boy. Until next time, y'all, have a good one.